2009, the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art announced plans for an expansion that would ultimately triple their square footage. Now, they hoped to expand in place, keeping much of the existing building open during the construction. There would be, pardon our dust signs and other disruptions, but they would be there all the way through. That was the hope. But then the architects and the engineers drew their drawings and ran their numbers and presented some very unwelcome news to the museum leadership. SF MoMA would not be able to stay open. In fact, they would have to close for 3 years. Museum director Neil Ben-Ezra would later recall that meeting as the darkest day of his tenure. They would be, in a word, displaced. Now, a displacement like this would represent a massive change for any organization. And massive change is a topic that's just in the air right now. I hear about it all the time when I talk to Tessitura organizations, changing audiences, changing programs, changing funding, changing buildings. It's unavoidable. So today I'm talking broadly about change by focusing very narrowly on a specific kind of change, displacement. Looking at organizations in our community, like SF MoMA, that experienced massive change in the face of displacement and yet learned how to thrive. What can we learn from them about preparing for change? Well, the SF MoMA leadership, recovering from the shock that the museum would have to close, started considering how to deal with it. Their first thought was to find a temporary location somewhere and wait out the construction there. But as those conversations continued, they found they actually had a second big problem. You see, in a series of focus groups with local residents, they found that the SF MoMA brand was considered cold and impersonal. So, they were facing being a museum without a museum, and their local community found them totally unapproachable. Yay! Well, Deputy Director Nan Keaton explained to me that these existential challenges actually galvanized them to act on their mission, making the art of our time a vital and meaningful part of public life. Rather than bemoan the loss of their four walls and their crappy focus groups, they took this as a moment of freedom, allowing them to release their collections directly to the people. And on June 2nd, 2013, they closed their doors. And for the next 35 months, they crisscrossed the Bay Area, partnering with 1, and then 2, and then 5, and then ultimately 21 other organizations with a series of exhibits and programs they called SF MoMA On the Go. Now, brilliantly, their first exhibit was not in another museum. It wasn't even in a building. It was here, at Crissy Field, a locals park, inhabited by joggers and frisbees and strollers. And to this bucolic scene, SF MoMA brought the park's first ever art installation, contrasting the views of the Golden Gate Bridge with a series of monumental sculptures inspired by it, by local artist Mark DeSuvero. They took potentially unapproachable art and made it instantly accessible to any audience, and it was a huge hit. Everyone loved it. I mean, everyone loved it. Was this cold and impersonal? No! Even without a home, they were acting on their mission. Now, when I asked Nan Keaton what the biggest thing was that they learned during their years on the go, she had this surprising insight. She said, "Do you ever notice that when you travel, you get a heightened sense of where you come from?" Think about that. I mean, I feel more like an American when I'm not in the US. And the team at SF MoMA felt that too. They had become accustomed to the normalness of being in their building with hushed murmurs about modern art. But on the outside, Well, the art was the same. But rather than murmur, they had to shout to be heard. We are modern art, and isn't it glorious? As Nan tells us, in the face of great change, you need a heightened sense of who you are, of your mission. With a maelstrom of change swirling all around you, let your mission be your feet firmly planted in the ground. SF MoMA was homeless for 3 years. And what happened to their brand recognition in all of that time? It skyrocketed. They had 30,000 members when they closed. And here, a year after their grand reopening, they have 87,000 members. And the data tells us that 1 in 10 San Francisco households is now a member. What started as their darkest day has resolved into triumph. Now, like SF MoMA, the Alliance Theater in Atlanta, Georgia, was also facing displacement. They were facing displacement because of a renovation. And like SF MoMA, there was a push for them to find a single temporary home. Faced with this idea, artistic director Susan Booth told me this. She said, we had a choice. We could hunker down, or we could do something ballsy. They chose ballsy. SF MoMA on the go, meet Alliance Theater on the road. Each year, the Alliance produces 12 shows on their 2 stages. But this season, as their home is being rebuilt, they're producing 12 shows in 12 totally different locations all across Atlanta, each with their own capacities and pricing. Thank God they have Tessitura. You see, the Alliance is facing their displacement by acting on their mission, which includes these words: deeply engaging with their local community and modeling radical inclusion. See, the Alliance is ensuring that these 12 stops are far more than extended stay rentals. No, they're treating them like on-site residencies, partnering with each location to bring kids programs, workshops, and much else to each neighborhood along with the show. Because let's face it, when the largest producing theater in the American South lands on your street corner, it's going to be a moment. And the Alliance is making sure that that moment is going to be transcendent. Now, I talked to Susan Booth about this approach. She recalled her days as the Girl Scout. She said, we want to leave the campsite better than we found it. So, for instance, they're mounting a show at the Atlanta History Center in the midst of a Civil War exhibit. But the History Center doesn't have an electrical system that can support a full-scale theatrical production. So the Alliance is paying to upgrade their system, not only to cover their show, but to be beneficial for the History Center long after they've left. And SF MoMA, well, they were good Girl Scouts too. If you were a member to one of their on-the-go partners, you got reciprocal admission to a number of the on-the-go programs. And members of all 21 member organizations were there at their grand reopening in 2016. You see, SF MoMA and the Alliance found strength in having lots of partners. Of course they did. But they found that the key was being a great partner back. To survive in great change, you have to make great friends. But to thrive, you need to be a great friend too. So in their management book, Great by Choice, Jim Collins and Morton Hansen researched companies that succeed in turbulent times. And one thing all of these companies had in common was a concept that they called fire bullets and then cannonballs. These companies would not spend a lot of money on big innovations at first. Instead, they would try small things, fire little bullets until they hit something that really worked, and then they would aim their big cannonball resources at that. According to Collins and Hansen, companies that thrive in turbulence try lots and lots of small innovations and then double down on what works. Susan Booth at the Alliance, she pushed for them to go out on the road because she wanted to try 12 unique little bullets, knowing where to aim that cannonball when she came back in the future. Or, as she put it, we live in a time of rapid prototyping. Anyone who repeats when they could invent won't be around for very long. So they are rapid prototyping their entire season in museums, in a church basement, a Midsummer Night's Dream in the botanical garden. Now, perhaps my favorite rapid prototype comes to us from the UK and the Royal Shakespeare Company. Now, the story goes that years ago, backstage at their old Royal Shakespeare Theatre, the actors would savage the acoustics of the theater, saying that performing there was like standing on the cliffs of Dover addressing Calais. And in 2005, the decision was made to renovate the 70-year-old theater in hopes of improving their acoustics and making tons of other improvements as well. The RSC would be displaced for years. Two problems. One, in tiny Stratford-upon-Avon, where they are, they didn't have lots of partners and spaces to rely on like they do in Atlanta and San Francisco. They'd be on their own to find a temporary home. Second big problem, they were trying to tackle one of the trickiest challenges in theatrical design, acoustics, where you don't know if it actually works until the theater's built and the money's all spent. So they needed a temporary home, and they needed some certainty that the construction would be acoustically successful. And they came upon a brilliant solution. Right there, on campus, in just 11 months, they built a full-size, stripped-down prototype of what they wanted the new theater to be. And they made the prototype their temporary home. Plywood on the walls, super cheap carpeting, exposed everything. I was lucky enough to see a production of The Twelfth Night there in 2009, and it was Spartan, and it was a little dusty, and it was wonderful. You see, to remain nimble, the RSC embraced a form of rapid prototyping like I had never seen before. Oh, and get this, they actually got the acoustics wrong in the prototype. Yeah, the sound was too focused over the stage and it didn't dissipate correctly. But because they did it there first, on the cheap, they were able to rewrite the drawings for the final product where they nailed it. You see, the prototype was like a single plywood bullet that allowed them to aim their big cannonball pounds at the final product. Now, I found that all three of these organizations, in the face of great change, innovated with rapid prototyping and found success in unusual places. Now, displacement is hard in the best of times. But these three organizations had one key luxury in common. The displacement was their idea. They had time to plan and raise money. And I began to wonder, would these themes hold water if the displacement wasn't their idea? Well, to help answer that question, let's go now to Nashville, Tennessee. On August 24th, 2008, the Tessitura Learning and Community Conference held its opening welcome on the stage of the beautiful 2-year-old Schermerhorn Center, the home of the Nashville Symphony. Less than 2 years later, on May 1st, 2010, the single worst flood in Nashville's history decimated the city, caused $40 million of damage to the Schermerhorn, and rendered the Nashville Symphony homeless for 8 months. They were displaced overnight. Shortly thereafter, they worked to finish up the last 20 performances of their 2010 season. And when I talked to Alan Valentine, their president and CEO then and now, I expressed some disbelief at this last part. I mean, with the city in turmoil, with FEMA setting up camp all over town, no one would have blamed the symphony if they had canceled the rest of the season to focus on survival? Well, this is what Alan said to me. He said, "It never crossed our mind to cancel. This is what we are meant to do, bring music to our community. In the face of great catastrophic change, the Nashville Symphony had a heightened sense of who they were. This is what we're meant to do." And they did it. With one exception, they didn't cancel any performances. They survived. They rescheduled 8 months of concerts in venues all over town by relying on the generosity of many friends and being a great friend back. And with a mobile box office that basically lived in the back of a symphony van for 8 months, they became the masters of rapid prototyping out of necessity. But there was one more theme that I saw out of this story that actually propagated the others as well. You see, they understood what they did and why they did it. But most importantly, they never lost sight of their who. Let me explain. So they did have to cancel one performance, or not so much cancel it as reimagine it. Just 6 days after the flood, they were scheduled to present pop artist Christopher Cross with the Nashville Pops. But without an auditorium, they took the show outside to the steps of the city courthouse and played a concert for the city for free. Thousands and thousands of people showed up. And after a week of news reports that were filled with tragedy and devastation, the headline the morning after their concert was this: "The symphony, their symphony, was the first ray of sunshine for this grieving city." You see, they never lost sight of who they were there to serve, the people of Nashville. Even in great change, never lose sight of your who. Now, when I was planning for this talk, I meant for it to be about preparing for change. But having talked to Alan and to Susan and to Nan, I realized I had my topic wrong. We shouldn't be preparing for change. We need to institutionalize it. Rather than buying a life preserver, we need to learn how to swim in the rapids. The Alliance Theater is planning to continue the road trips even after they're back home. And the Nashville Symphony took lessons from their tragedy that's making them stronger still today. Change doesn't stop. It doesn't. And neither can we. We in this industry must embrace change if we are going to endure. And to illustrate why we must, I have one more displacement story for you. Not about a displaced institution, but about a displaced man. Because as Don Youngberg tells us, it's all about the people. Let me tell you about Juan. So Juan was born in Honduras. And even as a boy, he knew that he was a descendant of the Mayans, the Central American civilization that had its apex 1,000 years ago. And Juan was fascinated by the fact that his bloodline traced back to this famously innovative civilization. And for Juan, the Mayans came alive when he would explore the local Mayan ruins near where he grew up. On one memorable occasion, he remembers coming to a clearing and seeing a huge Mayan stela rising up out of the vines. But in Honduras at that time, looking like a Mayan was not something to celebrate. They didn't study that culture in his school, and his father would scold him if he brought it up. Even as he explored those ruins, he felt a pang of shame. Now, that was 60 years ago, and Juan has spent the last 30 in the US. He and his wife live in Fort Worth, Texas now to be near a granddaughter. And it was there not long ago that he saw an ad in the newspaper that brought all of those childhood emotions flooding back. It is without hyperbole that I say that this ad would change his life. First developed by the Science Museum of Minnesota and brought to life in Dallas, Texas by the Perot Museum of Nature and Science, Hidden Worlds Revealed is a soaring exhibit of the Mayan culture. And Juan wasted no time heading over to Dallas. And when he walked into that exhibit for the first time, he was speechless, because rising up in front of him was a life-sized replica of the exact same Stella he had seen as a boy. And he was transported back in time as he walked from gallery to gallery. But the overriding emotion that he felt that day was this: an overwhelming sense of pride by this great exhibit celebrating his culture. You see, Juan, for 6 decades, had been, in a sense, displaced culturally. And he found his place right there at the Perot Museum. This is what we're meant to do. With a world that's churning and lurching and changing all around us, we, in the business of arts and culture, must remain steadfast. Now, if the Perot was a good friend to Juan, well, Juan was a great friend back. So moved was he by this exhibit that he went right out when he finished and went over to the info desk and asked simply, "How can I help?" And now, Juan is one of their most popular volunteers, providing bilingual interpretation and telling some stories along the way. Life-changing indeed. Now, I first heard Juan's story from Sadie Prater, systems analyst at the Perot. Sadie's with us here today. Now, like many of us, Sadie chose to work in culture because she wanted to make a difference in people's lives. And she has been so taken by Juan's story because he put a face and a person and a positive outcome on her life's work. Institutionally, when the Nashville Symphony focused on their who, it was the people of Nashville recovering from tragedy. And institutionally, when SF MoMA focused on their who, it was making the art of our time accessible for the people of San Francisco. But individually, for us, I say let's narrow our focus to one person at a time. Sadie is doing great work at the Perot Museum in part because she never loses sight of a person like Juan. So Mother Teresa is credited with saying this: we can't do great things in this world, only small things with great love. So let us all commit to doing our small part in the face of great change. Know who you are. Be a friend that's true. Never stop innovating, and focus on your who. The world is changing so fast. Let's make sure that we, in the world of arts and culture, continue to change the world for the better, one person at a time. Thank you.